Hi, everyone. We'll just give folks a second to join. Welcome to the Venezuela Solidarity Network monthly webinar and online picket, today co-organized with Venezuela Analysis. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Grab a tea or a coffee and we'll start shortly. Hello again. Welcome again to everybody to today's Venezuela Solidarity Network online picket and monthly webinar. Before I go any further, I want to make sure people know that today we have interpretation. Interpretation is being provided by Julieta and Mercedes, who are going to carry us through this actually entire program bilingual, which is really very important to us, and we're glad that they're able to join in this way. So if you'd like to join the system of interpretation, you go down to the bottom of your screen and you can choose whether to participate in English or Spanish. The program today will be in English, so you only really need the interpretation if you are speaking Spanish. We'll put the links in the chat as well. Bienvenidos a todos y todas. En el caso que hay gente aquí que está participando en español anoche, bienvenidos. Y hay una interpretación hoy. Y si quieres unir al sistema de interpretación, si puedes entrar al sistema, hay un icono de globo abajo en tu ecrán o en tu teléfono y puedes unir con este sistema con seleccionado de español. Y vamos a poner las instrucciones también en el chat. Bienvenidos. Welcome again, everyone, to today's discussion, why we must stand with Venezuela. My name is Allison Bodine. I'm with the Venezuela Solidarity Network, a new network in North America of organizations standing in solidarity with Venezuela against US, Canada, European Union imperialist attacks. And I'm also the coordinator of Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice, Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, and author of a book on Venezuela called Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Venezuela from Battle of Ideas Press. It is my pleasure to host this discussion today at a critical time for Venezuela. As all of us, I'm sure, are very aware, we are in the last 60 days of the presidency of Joe Biden in the United States. But we are also coming very quickly upon the inauguration of President Nicolas Maduro to serve as the president of Venezuela on January 10th, following his election at the end of July of this year. Since July 28th in the presidential election, there's been increasing rhetoric and attacks against Venezuela coming from the United States and their lackeys like the government of Canada. As we are here today, just a little over a month from January 10th and the inauguration of President Nicolas Maduro, already there's more posturing taking place that we'll explore further today. The U.S. House of Representatives passed an act called the Bolivar Act, trying to codify further sanctions against Venezuela. There have been arrests of U.S. mercenaries in Venezuela involved in plots to overthrow the government. And there, of course, is the recent statements of U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on X or Twitter, recognizing Edmundo Gonzalez as the president-elect of Venezuela. Edmundo Gonzalez, far-right opposition candidate who did not win the presidential election on July 28th in Venezuela. So in these conditions, we wanted to host a discussion where we further talk about how Venezuelans went to the polls on July 28th for a presidential election with the imperialist pistol pressed firmly against the skulls. their skulls, and how US imperialism has conditioned and sharpened every aspect of the Bolivarian Revolution's internal contradictions, while a stratum of US-based intellectuals make false left critiques that deliberately obscure the permanent siege against the country, or what we may sometimes refer to as blockade or sanctions. While conversely, Venezuela's social movements rightly regard these threats as existential and continue to firmly stand with the Maduro government. To host this discussion, we are co-organizing as the Venezuela Solidarity Network this webinar with Venezuela Analysis, an independent English language website dedicated to producing news and analysis about the current political situation in Venezuela and countering the corporate media narrative. And to do that, we have Caracas-based Ricardo Vaz, who is an editor and writer at Venezuela Analysis, and Lucas Corner, who joined the Venezuela Analysis team in 2015, who I'll introduce more fully later on. But I wanted to frame our discussion tonight and really welcome people to join this discussion, because as the Venezuela Solidarity Network, we want to take the information that we learn in these webinars, these online pickets, with us to our conversations with people in the streets, to the public meetings that we attend in solidarity with Palestine, to the conversations that we have with fellow activists about how to defend Venezuela against imperialist attacks. And I'm hoping we can have a really fruitful discussion tonight about how to counter the US imperialist media narrative, especially leading up to the inauguration of President Maduro on January 10th of next year. And then, of course, President Trump taking office later that month and what that means. So I hope that sparked some initial ideas and thinking from everybody about questions, because we do want to have a great discussion here today. And we're really excited to have Lucas and Ricardo here with us. And I also want to encourage people, we can post about it later because I don't want you to go and read the article now, but what sparked this webinar was an article that they both co-authored called A Critique of Whitewashing the Imperialist Siege on Venezuela. And that's kind of what started the discussion in the Venezuela Solidarity Network for the importance of this webinar, and what led us to want to host this together here today. So without further ado, I will introduce Ricardo Vaz, who's going to start us off here today. Ricardo is an editor and writer at Venezuela Analysis, and also a member of the grassroots collectives Tatooine TV and Utopics, who you've probably seen some of their excellent graphics out recently. So here we are. Ricardo, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Hi, Alison, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. We really appreciate the invitation. It's also great to see so many familiar names here in attendance, people who have for many years pushed forward the solidarity, the international solidarity with Venezuela. I told Alison we're going to make short presentations, both of us. I'm going to tackle more the current affairs part, sanctions, the incoming Trump presidency, and what to expect, Marco Rubio, and all that. And I'll leave the hardest part to Lucas, which is to kind of frame the article that we published and again put it into the relevant context. But the most interesting part, in our opinion, is to actually have some kind of back and forth with the people here, as Alison was saying, so to see how we can help these discussions and help further the solidarity work and the support for Venezuelan sovereignty, the opposition to US imperialism in the global north. So, for many years, when we talk about US policy towards Venezuela, we say that it starts and ends with sanctions. And so the question is, now that Trump is back in the presidency, what's going to happen? Because we had maximum pressure last time around with this circus that was called the interim presidency that flamed out quite spectacularly. So what is to be expected the second time around? There's a lot of speculation from realistic to wishful thinking. And then we're getting some signs, like, for example, the appointment of Marco Rubio. But the one thing to keep in mind is that we are not very far away from maximum pressure. I mean, we are maybe at 95% pressure. The one thing that the Biden administration did was to grant this license to Chevron. And I'll mention a bit more later on how sanctions also have this kind of longer term effect of undermining Venezuelan sovereignty. And then there was this 6-month license, General License 44, GL 44, which, for all intents and purposes, allowed Venezuela to sell its oil without discounts, without shady intermediaries. But it ended, but it didn't bring any kind of significant qualitative improvements for the oil industry. So the architecture of the sanctions policy against Venezuela and against the oil industry in particular is very much still in place. So in that sense, there's not really much new I mean, if that was the goal for Trump to sanction. However, it's not just about the codes and the executive orders and the licenses issued by the Treasury Department. It's also about enforcement. So if you remember back in early 2020, Venezuela was using Rosneft as an intermediary. So Venezuela would sell the crude to Rosneft, and Rosneft would redirect it to other destinations. And then Rosneft was hit with secondary sanctions. So now, whereas the Trump administration cannot really sanction the oil industry anymore, it can really start ramping up the pressure in terms of going after the intermediaries who kind of facilitate the oil trade. So, there might be schemes. I'm just speculating that all of this, of course, is done in secret as it should be. Companies that are registered in Hong Kong, and they find a trailer and then they crack down on that. However, there's a different perspective which focuses on the word is transactional. That Trump always has a transactional approach to politics, and perhaps that's what makes him a bit uncomfortable for the powers that be. And that has to do, on one hand, with his promise of mass deportations of migrants, in particular Venezuelan migrants, who have been so harshly vilified during the campaign. And for that, he needs a line to the Maduro government. That's, for all intents and purposes, the authority here in Venezuela, and that's not really looking like there's going to be a change anytime soon. I'll talk about that as well. And so, what we need to understand is that Trump does not necessarily need a victory. He only needs something that he can sell as a victory. So he can say that, we are being very harsh with Venezuela, and then come to some sort of minor backroom agreement that will allow him to deport people back to Venezuela, and then he can claim both things. And that takes us, for example, to the Bolivar Act that you brought up in the introduction. I wrote on Twitter that basically these Florida lawmakers, I was going to call them something else, that was their greatest life achievement, to build Bolivar into an acronym. But in essence, the Bolivar Act doesn't really change anything. I mean, it doesn't forbid anything that's not already forbidden. And if there's something that gets a waiver, it also doesn't block that. So it is symbolic more than everything. And it goes to show this thing that I was saying, there might be a desire to present, look how tough we're going to be. And behind the curtain, looking for to solve other priorities in Trump's own perspective, in the case of migration. And also, I mean, if we're talking about sanctions, the pattern that we've seen in recent times during the Biden administration, I mean, from the start, there was an admission through these, anonymous officials who speak to the press, that the Biden administration was aware that the previous strategy did not work, but they didn't come up with anything better to do. And so the advantage of keeping sanctions in place, besides strangling the Venezuelan economy, is that it also increases the leverage for foreign corporations to negotiate. So when we talk about Chevron is a minority partner in 4 joint ventures here in Venezuela. I mean, according to Venezuelan legislation, PDVSA, the state oil company, must always hold a majority stake in any joint project. And so Chevron is a minority partner in 4 of them, yet in contravening Venezuelan law, in these kinds of exceptions and sacrifices that you have to make under these difficult conditions, Chevron is the one that's in charge of oil field operations and in charge of sales. So it is effectively getting a much larger slice of the pie because than it should, according to its stake in the projects, it's getting a larger share because sanctions precisely increase its leverage in negotiating with the Venezuelan government. Same for recent natural gas projects that we saw announced, offshore drilling of this mostly unexplored natural gas reserves, and that's going to take place with Trinidad and Tobago's state energy company, NGC, the National Gas Corporation, and in one case with Shell, the other with BP. And both these projects are going to take place without PDVSA holding a stake. So whereas in oil, PDVSA must hold a majority, in natural gas, there was a loophole that actually Chavez pointed out that the loophole needed to be closed, but it wasn't. So natural gas project can be fully owned by foreign corporations. So in this case, PDVSA, because of its more difficult negotiating position, accepted these joint projects without holding a stake. It would still get taxes and royalties, which are higher than anywhere in the region. But it goes to show, and these are 25, 30-year projects, it goes to show how sanctions are used to slowly undermine Venezuelan sovereignty in the long run. And so to circle back to the point I was trying to make, this is something that Trump might try to take advantage of, and especially if he has these lobbyists from Texas and the Gulf in his ear, trying to leverage sanctions to secure deals that are as favorable as possible for corporations and as unfavorable as possible for the Venezuelan state and the Venezuelan people, and putting the Venezuelan government in this very difficult situation of having to choose between a bad deal and no deal. And to start closing, as we look toward January 10, as Alison was saying, there has been a ramp up in rhetoric and efforts at destabilization. Sorry. And we can expect that in the run-up to Maduro's reinauguration for a third term in January. Last night, Maria Corina Machado, who nobody knows where she is, sent this very cryptic message saying every Sunday she's going to come down from the proverbial mountain with instructions, and people should be paying attention to the signs. So, I mean, there have been recent accidents, or as the government announces, acts of sabotage. One affected a very important natural gas hub. So we might see, again, sorry, I'm nursing a bit of a cold. You might see more little incidents like that to try and destabilize the country in the run-up to January 10. I don't expect, contrary to his bravado now that he's abroad, I don't expect Edmundo Gonzalez to fly back to the country. I mean, if he actually had any will to stand up, he would have stayed here. So I don't expect that. I don't expect any mass rallies. I mean, the opposition tried it after the election, and its attendance slowly, I mean, rather quickly dwindled to almost nothing. And I mean, if they cannot gather their own crowds in this wealthy part of East Caracas, they don't really seem to have the strength to really force something through the streets. And so the other option are these harebrained military, paramilitary plots like we saw with Operation Gideon in 2020. Again, I mean, it might happen. All it takes is a few crazy people with weapons. But I think the Venezuelan armed forces and security forces have demonstrated that they are very ready and very wary of these threats, and quite ready to snuff them out quickly, or even before they even hatch. So I am expecting heightened destabilization in the run-up to January 10, but not anything too critical. And the final thing, this was something that was brought up in the chat. Blinken, so the Biden administration is trying to corner the incoming administration, try and limit its possibilities. We kind of saw the same last time around, when Trump at the last minute named Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism to forced Biden to take it out, and of course he did not take it out. So Blinken recognized Edmundo as president-elect. I don't expect there's going to be, I mean, I could be wrong. I don't expect there's going to be any kind of swearing in ceremony and a government in exile or any kind of repeat of the Guaido experiment. I think they're going to stick to this rhetoric that, Edmundo won the election and whatnot. Even Edmundo said this now, he's not going to swear himself in abroad. And this is one thing to know about Trump, given his reality TV background, he doesn't really want to look like a fool, even if Venezuela is probably not at the top of his priorities. So I wouldn't expect him to rerun something that flamed out quite spectacularly last time around and had him fall out with his advisors like Bolton, Abrams, and Pompeo. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on to Lucas for a more broad and theoretical approach, and we look forward to any feedback and questions you might have.
Excellent. Thank you, Ricardo, for keeping it brief. I will remind Lucas to speak slowly. I think our interpreters probably kept up, but it is not easy work, as you know. There is also, I hope you feel better. Yes, have some tea. I know a number of us are probably dealing with some colds, so we can relate. But thank you for joining us despite still being a bit sick. Lucas Corner joined the Venezuela Analysis team in 2015, and he's currently pursuing a doctorate at Harvard University. So that's the bio I have. It's a pleasure to have you, Lucas, and welcome. I look forward to hearing more about the article. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm also fighting a cold, so you'll bear with me, and I will definitely try to speak slowly. Bueno, buenas noches a todas y todos. But in preparing this talk, I returned to the work of the Bissau Guinean revolutionary Amilcar Cabral, also the Lebanese Marxist political economist Ali Kadri, as well as the Italian Marxist philosopher Domenico Lacerdo, to reflect about US-led imperialism in Venezuela, but also the northern bourgeois class position that we know as Western Marxism. So I'm going to begin with some general theoretical remarks about these questions I just outlined, but then I'll also refer briefly to our own article and the targets of our polemic. And I'll close with some brief comments about the current Venezuelan reality, as Ricardo has very in-depth given us a pretty a thorough rendering. So let's begin with a definition of imperialism, as a point of departure. The essential characteristic of imperialist domination, writes Amilcar Cabral, is the denial of the historical process of the dominated by means of violent usurpation of the freedom of the process of development of the national productive forces. So let's break that jargon down. In other words, imperialism is the control that's being exercised by the states, the United States, the Western Europe, Japan, etc., Israel as a subcontractor, the Australia, Canada, etc., as embodiment capital, the control that they exercise over the means of production of Southern social formation. So we're not just talking about, we're talking about the tools, we're talking about the land, we're talking about the infrastructure, we're talking about the factories, we're talking about the plantations or the farms, but we're also talking about nature and human living labor itself, human beings who are engaging in labor and are the laboring class itself. So imperialism, in usurping the control of the land and the labor in the rest of the globe, in the global south, imperialism can thus guarantee that the permanent extraction of surplus value, basically plundering the rest of the world, transferring this wealth from the periphery to the core. But however, this is only half of the story. The other half, as Ali Kadri shows in following Marx, is that imperialism isn't just about the production of commodities, the production of things that have a exchange value that get exchanged, in order to be realized as profit. But it's all, mainly through the super exploitation of Southern labor, that is, working people and workers in the global South, basically forcing them to labor below the conditions of their subsistence, not paying them what they basically need to reproduce themselves, transferring those costs of social reproduction onto the laborers of themselves, and most importantly, onto working class women in the global South. So it's not just about that. It's also the flip side of imperialism is the production of waste. And what is that? That's the industrial annihilation of human beings and nature, which is itself a value forming activity, which itself is an incredibly profitable activity. And this is a crucial blind spot of Western Marxism and precisely of the kinds of academics that we're critiquing. And this it really speaks to the inability of the Western left to reckon with what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon right now as we speak. In short, what is inherent or imminent to capital is what Kadri calls a logic of systemic genocide that continually produces millions and millions of cadavers, millions and millions of corpses, premature deaths across the global South. And this occurs both through the spontaneous activity of the market that, of course, brutally economizes human lives and nature, displacing these costs of reproduction onto onto society and what is euphemistically called externalities. But it's also, in argue, even more important is imperialist war in its diverse modalities as a primary weapon in the hands of the US-led imperialist class for evaporating the productive forces of the South, amassing super profits in the short term, as we're seeing from Palestine to Ukraine with Raytheon and all these massive financialized backed weapons deals that just shore up accumulation for U.S. capital, U.S.-led capital. But it's also in the long term about diminishing the share of value occurring to labor in the periphery. It's about weakening the working class on a global scale. And that's why it's imperialist war in the current period, of late neocolonialism, as we call it. Imperialist war plays a crucial role in materially and ideologically battering the Southern working class in order to sustain these conditions of extermination and enslavement that we're seeing deepened across the globe. However, the imperialist ruling class headquartered in Washington, this fascist entente headquartered in Washington, in Brussels, in London, and etc. It cannot accomplish this genocidal feat without the active participation of the northern working class, and above all, the intelligentsia as wage mercenaries for capital. And here we see the trade unions and the universities as absolutely indispensable partners in manufacturing consent for imperialist war and serving as transmission belts for the propaganda centrally diffused through the corporate media apparatus, relaying it to the working class and petty bourgeois people who in the imperialist core who might otherwise be susceptible to more radical anti-systemic politics. Sorry if I'm speaking too fast. My apologies to the translators, the interpreters. As Domenico Lacerdo shows, the ideological currency of these northern intellectuals is what we call Western Marxism, which is nothing more than kind of a bourgeois counterinsurgent class position whose real sole aim is to mystify what we know as the principal contradiction of capitalism. That is the contradiction between US-led imperialist capital and the international working class that is concentrated in and led by the South. And by its vanguard, by the axis of resistance in this moment. This anti-Marxist heresy, because it has very little, it's a complete revisionism that is promoted by these intellectuals. It basically promises a kind of social democratic class collaborationism in lieu of basically trying to gain slightly better conditions for Northern workers and intellectuals from the imperialist bosses at the expense of their brothers and sisters in the global South, basically scabbing for empire. This social democratic kind class collaborationism, it's opposed to to anti-imperialist national liberation struggle as the motor of history, as the primary, the only means to solve this contradiction and guarantee the freedom, the development, and the freedom, as Cabral puts it, to restore the inalienable right of every people to have their own history. That is, to free the process of development of the national productive forces, to guarantee that people have conditions to live with dignity, both materially and mentally and ideologically. So we can, with all this in mind, and I apologize for bombarding you with all of this theory, but I think it is really important to ground ourselves. We can turn to Venezuela and contemporary, what is specific about it in the current moment. The articles that we critiqued in our piece, which you're encouraged to read, are prime examples of this Western Marxist class position. Both academics of leading Western, of important Western universities. Of course, I myself come from a Western imperialist university, but we know that class, the one's position is not the class is ideological as much as it is material. That both these academics employ an idealist methodology in which they treat Venezuela as if it was located on distant Mars rather than at the back door of the U.S. empire, facing a quarter century of relentless regime change efforts and almost a decade of sanctions now, which of course forms the inescapable context for analyzing the contradictions within the Venezuelan state and the broader society, social formation, as we call it. This is what we call methodological nationalism. It allows them to abstract Venezuela from the global class struggle, in which it is, of course, a key battlefront, and it leads to them to the ludicrous and deeply disingenuous conclusion that the overthrow of the Bolivarian government would somehow entail an advance for the left locally and internationally. We have, of course, we've heard the same argument in countless other cases, whether it be Libya or Syria or Iran or Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, etc. So we don't need to waste our time on that. But what we should emphasize here is that this bourgeois ideological smokescreen is aimed to conceal, its purpose is to conceal the real reason for the unceasing imperialist aggression against Venezuela. And despite what many well-meaning comrades think, it's actually not primarily the fact that Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves. As always, we have to keep in mind the primacy of politics, which often ruling class strategists have a better understanding than we do. Parenthetically, we can note Venezuela continues to be targeted because of its position as in the global counter-hegemonic infrastructure that it helped to build in alliance with anti-systemic states like Cuba, Iran, Zimbabwe, China, and to a different degree, Russia. And it's not just the BRICS, we're talking about a whole broader array of different kinds of regional and counter-hegemonic blocks and formations that includes, of course, the BRICS, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also we can talk about the ALBA, we can talk about the CELAC, UNASUR, despite the fact that they have been heavily besieged and weakened by the US, in addition to countless other kinds of more bilateral alliances and relationships. So in devastating Venezuela through sanctions and scorched earth regime change, the US-led imperialism has sought to deal a blow to labor both regionally and globally, for which precisely precisely because the Venezuelan Revolution has constituted, the Bolivarian Revolution has constituted such an important political and ideological beacon for laboring people, for working people throughout the world, for revolutionaries around the world. And this is like precisely the torch that U.S.-led imperialism has sought of course, to put out. And it is clear that notwithstanding the limited arrangements that Ricardo mentioned with Chevron, and potentially we'll see with Trump, with other U.S. transnationals that help offset strategic energy vulnerabilities on the part of the U.S. empire as it gears up for war against China, as it continues to prosecute a war against Russia on the front of Ukraine, et cetera. That, notwithstanding these arrangements, we have to be clear that the objective of the U.S. empire vis-a-vis Venezuela is to keep Venezuelan oil mostly in the ground. Very similar in many ways to Iraq in the 1960s and in other cases, and prevent it from being in subsequent decades with Iraq and also with Iran, because the U.S. objective with Iran is likewise to keep it in the ground and prevent this oil from being used to finance anti-systemic projects locally, regionally, and globally, as we saw under Chavez and during the early Maduro years when there was still significant oil income. So the goal, of course, is level Venezuela's productive forces and to prevent it from advancing a viable and, in fact, enviable socialist model. And this is crucially done through attempting to materially and ideologically demobilize the Venezuelan popular classes and their movements, which are the motive force of the Bolivarian Revolution, and continue to be so. Nevertheless, and try to close with a positive note, despite the enormous hardship and suffering that has been imposed on the Venezuelan people over the past decade, destroying countless lives, Venezuela, like Syria, like Iran, Lebanon, Palestine, and countless other sister nations, has not been defeated. And I think we need to keep that, we need to really center that and keep that in mind, because it is precisely the goal of this imperialist counterinsurgency and of this kind of Western Marxist kind of charlatanism that is being promoted, is to snuff out that hope and to impose ideological submission and defeat, not only on the Venezuelan people, but on the working classes globally, and on revolutionaries and radical and left people in the global north that are committed to anti-systemic politics. So in that, I will close and open it up to questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Yeah, you're right. Your internet's a little bit choppy, but it held on, basically. So I thank you for that. Ricardo, thank you again. That closes off kind of our speakers portion in the panel, but we do want to open it up for questions and answers and some discussion. Just for giving people a heads up, I do have some important announcements to make when we're done with that, and then we will do our group photo at the end for US-Canada Hands Off Venezuela, as is the tradition with these online pickets and webinars that have been going on for over 3 years, actually. So if people want to put their questions in the chat, I see that we've gotten a few of them from the chat, but of course the Q&A box is super helpful. Thank you again, Ricardo and Lucas. To start us off, I did want to see if Roger Harris, who's here with Task Force on the Americas and the Venezuela Solidarity Network, could actually start off with an initial question while we collect the other ones in the chat.
Yes. Well, thank you, Ricardo and Lucas. Very much looking forward to this presentation. A little bit more about what's happening on the ground in Venezuela would be quite welcome. And just last night, Maria Corina Machado, the designated leader of the opposition, designated because she was designated by the U.S. Congress, actually. Um, but she was on national TV in the US, and she claimed that the opposition to the Bolivarian Revolution is stronger than it's ever been. And not only that, but more unified than it's ever been in Venezuela. Well, you're on the ground there. What evidence do we have that Maria was correct? And just as an aside, kind of curious, is there any rumors about whether she's actually in Venezuela?
Should I answer?
Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
so I mean, Maria Corina Machado is free to say whatever she wants, but the reality on the ground actually is very different. And uh, we saw after the elections that there were these 2 days of significant unrest. I'm not gonna undersell it in any way, but it died out quite quickly, and also as a consequence of the response from security forces. And then after that, there were maybe 3 or 4 attempts by the Venezuelan opposition to mobilize its base. And in the last one, there were so few people that even Maria Corina Machado did not show up, did not turn out. So it's not clear if she's in Venezuela or not. The Maduro government claims that she's abroad. I think that's actually a dangerous thing to claim, because either, I mean, if she's here or if she's abroad and manages to come back, then she can actually present that as some kind of victory. But right now, if you go out on the streets, people have moved on from the electoral process quite quickly for many different reasons, including and not underestimating the fact that it's still a very difficult and precarious economic situation. So people have to go on with their lives, and they have to continue working and opening their shops and what have you. And for all intents and purposes, from an institutional standpoint, the electoral question is closed after the Supreme Court issued its ruling, and basically that was the end of it. So now, I mean, Maria Corina Machado has January 10 circled out on her calendar, and she needs to make something happen. But it looks a lot like wishful thinking. I mean, we saw this crowdfunding campaign that had this timer. It said Casi Venezuela, we're almost there, Venezuela, and they programmed the timer, but they didn't program it properly, so it got to 0, and then it started counting to negative numbers, and then it turned out that this was a timer for a crowdfunding operation with Eric Prince behind it, and then the person who was involved actually distanced himself, saying that these are people who have a history of embezzlement, and so I don't want anything to do with it. So it doesn't seem like there's any serious attempt to effectively trigger regime change. These constant calls for the military to rebel have always fallen on deaf ears. The Venezuelan army has a very coherent and strong ideological base, so it's not going to go anywhere. And so basically, at least based on the evidence, I'm not sure what Maria Corina Machado is referring to. In fact, the other sectors of the Venezuelan opposition also want to move on and do actual politics and look forward to the regional and legislative elections coming up next year.
Thank you. Did you have any thoughts you wanted to share, Lucas?
No, I think Ricardo covered all his bases. Of course, I would stress the economic question, and I think that was very crucial in the days subsequent to the elections, in which we had two pretty days in which there was significant political violence, and there was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and we were actually quite worried that the government might collapse, especially on the Monday right after the elections, the 29th. But by that Wednesday, within 48 hours, everything had pretty much stabilized, and people went. And I think that we shouldn't necessarily underestimate the economic question, that people want to and need to maintain their economic livelihoods, and they're not really interested in these kinds of U.S.-backed opposition scorched earth politics that are aimed at completely devastating the economy and preventing people from going about their livelihoods. We saw this during the Guarimbas in 2014, 2017, and it's more pronounced today that people definitely want to work, and they need to work, despite the incredibly, unfortunately, the low wages that are a reflection in part of the U.S. led siege on the country, but also other factors. And that I think as long as things remain economically stable, and they have so far, that they will continue to do so, absent a change with Chevron. Ricardo can correct me on that, but I think that as long as there's no change with the status of Chevron, I think things should remain economically stable. And that also it's Christmas and everyone just wants to enjoy the holidays, and that you should never underestimate the importance of Christmas in Venezuela.
Yeah,
So
just
there is a question, but go ahead. Yeah, go ahead,
yeah,
Ricardo.
just to complement that and also address a couple of things that have been here in the chat on how, as anti-imperialists, address these questions about the details regarding the election. And I think one of the things to stress is that the biggest obstacle to democracy in Venezuela is the US imperialist siege. And so to fall into this trap of trying to litigate the electoral minutiae is to actually disregard this entire background and what we were mentioning before of Venezuelans actually going to the polls with a gun pressed firm to their heads. And so the debate as anti-imperialists should not be on how the Venezuelan election is going to be validated from abroad. It's not up to anyone abroad to decide that, but actually how to fight back and oppose the greatest purveyor of violence globally, which remains by and large the largest obstacle to not just democracy in a very broad sense. If we're also talking about other realms like the economy, as Lucas was just mentioning. So yeah, it was just to add that. And on Chevron, there has been lobbying for the administration to revoke that license. I don't expect it, not just because of Chevron's lobbying abilities, but also it would give out we know how markets as these kind of defined entities are very jittery. And so with all the genocide and genocide related things going on in the Middle East, there's a lot of wariness in driving up fuel prices, especially domestically.
Yeah, I think we should never be dismissive of the impact of sanctions and the intent of sanctions to introduce instability, to bring about the overthrow of the government in Venezuela in this case, but it's been the same policies have been applied by the US government. And I think we can, unfortunately, we have many examples of this. And I think that also, just as someone that observed the presidential elections and then returned to Venezuela a month later as an observer of the communal elections, I saw very much how the feeling in the streets had changed quickly, that people had, as you've said, kind of moved on past the election. President Maduro, is elected president. He's going to take office on January 10th. Let's deal with other issues on the streets. Let's, work on building Venezuela sovereign and independent. And I think that I could feel that just in that 1 month of being in the country. And I think as well that it's important that as much as we can, that we work to share the voices of the grassroots in Venezuela, of people mobilized in Venezuela. I know a lot of us probably in the chat are already active in this, but that means sharing videos from Venezuela Analysis and other organizations where people are going out into the streets at these rallies, are talking to people about the impact of sanctions, and are filming what is actually happening on the streets and sharing that around. But back to Christmas, where we were just talking that Lucas brought up, we are going into the Christmas season. And there is a question in the chat here from Leonardo Flores asking if we can talk more about Operation No Christmas, which was recently discussed by Diosdado Cabello, who's in charge of the Ministry of the Interior in Venezuela, this latest destabilization attempt. Does anyone have anything they would like to share about Operation No Christmas?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it was just a preliminary press conference, but I mean, first of all, hi, Leonardo, great to see you here. Um, there have been at least 3 or 4 of these um revelations by the Interior Ministry, now run by this Cabello, of seizures of weapons and arrests of foreign nationals who are alleged to be involved in destabilization plots. So there was, I mean, the most notable case was a U.S. Navy SEAL who was here in Venezuela with no real explanation so far. But then there were also 2 Spanish citizens who were claimed to be part of the Spanish intelligence agency, and as far as I understand, they were released a couple of weeks ago. So Diosdado's plan, I mean, the plan that Diosdado unveiled as being tackled by Venezuelan authorities involved some businessmen from Zulia in Western Venezuela, who were facilitating arms shipments, and these arms were decommissioned. And apparently, the most important person here in that business guild fled, and they are also alleged to have ties with not just Maria Corina Machado, but also with Colombian drug trafficking. But again, that was just a preliminary press conference. We should expect, as the investigation progresses, to have more information. It's also in the government's interest to actually ensure that everyone is on their toes and wary of these threats all the time.
Thank you. There was some talk in the chat earlier about Marco Rubio, what might be expected from Marco Rubio if he's affirmed as Secretary of State in the United States under the Trump administration. There's also a question here from Babette asking if we're concerned that the US Congress, either Biden or Trump, will more formally recognize Edmundo Gonzalez. Of course, like I mentioned, there was this tweet or X post by Blinken calling Edmundo Gonzalez the president-elect, but do you have any comments regarding whether we'll see something closer to what people have been referring to as this Guaido 2.0, or an attempt to really hand over stolen money essentially to this so-called opposition candidate?
Yeah, I'll take that, and maybe Lucas will complement. I mean, I hope the events don't make me look foolish for what I'm about to say. I don't expect it for 2 reasons. One is that it carries the shadow of the previous failure, and second, it actually reduces U.S. control over its Venezuela operations. You know, the fact that it has to go through this parallel structure, which then becomes very bureaucratic, with all these people trying to collect a paycheck and trying to plunder resources. In fact, the U.S. State Department and whatever other authorities are involved in this have much more control of the entire operation, of who they fund and so on, without having to deal with the circus of something else that's pretending to be a government. It won't change the fact that it still does not recognize the Maduro government, so these assets remain frozen, but the Trump administration, through the Treasury Department or the State Department, can actually have more control of the operation and actually more leverage to get its Venezuelan surrogates to do as they're told, without formally recognizing a parallel government.
All right, on
Yeah,
record, Ricardo.
I would
Lucas,
just
yeah, go ahead.
add to that, just more generally, I just personally don't see how Trump policy will be very much different from the Biden policy, given the Biden policy wasn't very much different at all from the original Trump policies. So if anything, I think that someone like Marco Rubio will probably prove less competent than Anthony Blinken in running the State Department, just given that he's never run anything in his life and he's just a fucking senator. He's just a hack, from Florida in the Senate who, is just a whore for APAC and other, weapons lobbyists. So I don't personally. I don't personally fear Marco Rubio as much as I would fear someone else. I think that, he's going to talk a tough game. But I mean, in terms of, like as Ricardo has mapped out, it's not, there's not a lot of big policy options for how they're going to, reshuffle this vis-a-vis Venezuela, given the broader vulnerabilities and crises that the U.S. empire is dealing with right now. And then I think it's better to have someone that is just so openly fascist as Rubio and the rest of the Trump administration is, than having this, bait and switch perennial sheepdogging that we get from the Democratic Party.
Of course, and we can't forget that the sanctions really intensified under Obama with the pronouncement that Venezuela was a threat to U.S. national security. And since then, subsequent administrations have now applied more sanctions and measures. It's now up, I think, at 930 or 940 measures that have been applied against the Venezuelan economy. So it's a very bipartisan policy. And I guess, Lucas, kind of where you were ending, people do sometimes say, at least, know your enemy. You know more clearly who your enemy is in the case of an incoming U.S. administration. So there was one question in the chat, which I will address, but I'll address it more to anyone else that is in the chat. It's someone looking for groups they might get involved with in Philly. So if anyone has any suggestions about groups in Philadelphia, feel free to send them to the person that posted that. He's looking for groups that might share a more similar analysis to one that's been presented here tonight. There's interest in talking somewhat about BRICS and Venezuela's not being accepted into BRICS. I won't go into the details. I'll let one of you do that. But does someone want to give some context or speak about BRICS and Venezuela?
Yeah, I can address that. That was a bit of a low blow from Brazil. There's no point in actually going into the details, but I think we also need to dampen enthusiasm a bit about the BRICS. I mean, here we were talking about a group of 11 or 13 rather, that were called partner nations. It's still not very clear where they're going to fit into the BRICS. I mean, the BRICS themselves still don't have a very solid structure. And when it comes to Venezuela, I mean, we can ask ourselves what's actually stopping not the countries, but the companies in the BRICS countries from coming and, let's say, rescuing the Venezuelan oil sector. And that wouldn't really change with Venezuela being a partner nation in the BRICS. I mean, that's there. These limitations are there because of US sanctions and over-compliance and secondary sanctions and so on. So while it would have been a diplomatic victory for Venezuela to be assumed into the BRICS, and I expect it will happen sooner or later. I mean, every year there's going to be new members. It wouldn't have significantly changed the reality here on the ground.
Thank you. Someone, David Paul, who's also here, and if anyone does have access to a microphone and would rather formulate a question and ask it in person, please feel free to raise your hand. But David Paul is asking for an update about the situation with the conflict in Essequibo, which was much more discussed in the media about 6 months ago. And how does that fit into the U.S. corporate plans for more control in the region and potential conflict for the U.S.? Maybe related, if we could have some comments as well about Southern Command and just kind of the U.S. Southern Command presence in the region.
The Essequibo question actually faded a bit from the news, and that might not actually be a bad thing because Venezuela has always insisted, I mean, sometimes with more or less belligerence, that this is a matter to be solved bilaterally with Guyana under the auspices of this 1966 Geneva Agreement. So the fact that it faded from the news could mean that at least there's a calmer atmosphere all around that could lead to fruitful negotiations. Of course, the US has always been intent on sabotaging that and actually using Guyana as a beachhead to increase its threat against Venezuela. Venezuela warned a few months ago of plans to set up military bases in the Essequibo itself or in Guyana. It also denounced the military exercises. I mean, there are always these joint military exercises with the countries from the Caribbean community that are no coincidence that they take place in Guyana. But as far as I know, there's still this process going on at the International Court of Justice. Venezuela has reiterated that it does not recognize the court's authority to rule on this matter, that this has to be solved directly between the two governments. There have been symbolic advances on this side, proclaiming Guyana Esequiba state and appointing authorities, even though they don't actually have a presence on the ground. But at least my hope is that a calmer atmosphere might lead to useful negotiations to find a solution that might actually draw a page over this 200-year issue.
Thank you. I appreciate both of your willingness. These questions have spanned a range of topics and updates about Venezuela and U.S. attacks and kind of the geopolitical considerations around Venezuela. So I appreciate your flexibility in answering these varied questions. We'll just do a few more. And then, as I said, I had some announcements to make. And of course, closing remarks from either of you, definitely encouraged. Norman Corner is asking, one huge blowback from the U.S. siege warfare sanctions against Venezuela that caused the greatest collapse of the modern economy's GMP of a country not at war, a 72% reduction in history. So referring to Venezuela's drop in their gross national product due to U.S. sanctions on the oil industry, is, of course, the migration of Venezuelans to the United States, which Trump capitalized, vaulting the unhinged, quote, invasion of the border to one of the top 3 issues in the presidential campaign in the U.S. Left out of the U.S. political debate is, of course, how the invasion, quote unquote, only began after the bipartisan economic siege warfare. Ergo, is there discussion in Venezuela about how to combat this ideological blowback that also has benefit for the U.S. capitalist class of blaming socialism for the migration rather than the savage siege warfare sanctions? More generally, maybe how is immigration addressed in Venezuela? Are there lessons we learn? Are there good replies or discussion points you think we should be raising with people that present Venezuela as this country that everyone is fleeing from, running to pursue the American dream once again, and so on?
Norm with a really straightforward and easy question, right, Ricardo? Yeah, I think obviously, I mean, Venezuela on the one hand has tried, the government has sought to counter the migration, the weaponization of migration, which of course is not unique to Venezuela, but is a constant feature of U.S. imperialism to destroy countries and then promote migration and then weaponize the migrants both within the U.S. as a right wing includes even a fascist demographic, as we've seen with Cubans and we've even seen with Eastern European groups. So this is not a new policy. The Venezuelan government, you've seen it's return to the land policy, which is sought to promote, obviously with, in a pretty limited and selective way, but, to the extent it has been able to, the return of numbers of migrants to the country, particularly from different parts of South America. However, of course, this is, limited by the fact is that people are not going to massively go back as long as the economy is, under siege. And, unless there really is, the productive forces are free to be developed by the Venezuelan state as they were under Chavez. And that is what the U.S. siege is designed to prevent from happening. So I think that the Venezuelan government is limited in what it can do from that point of view. I think that there's a lot of attendant questions too. There's also the issue of organized crime. We can look at Chile. That's not just the United States, but the so-called Tren de Aragua, which is one of the big, Venezuelan organized crime syndicates that's emerged in recent years. That I would also ask about what are its links with different state, intelligence agencies. I haven't looked into it, but it's apparently out of Chicago, but it's also operating heavily in Santiago de Chile It's also been one of the, going back to 2019, the Chilean, the rebellion in Chile against the brutal Piñera government was blamed on Venezuelans. So I mean, this constantly used this fake leaf. But I think it's a much more complex question of how from here, at least from Venezuela, how do you counter that, and how without fundamentally being able to recover the economy. And but even if you do succeed and I think Venezuela is beginning to see some modest economic recovery, many of these migrants have been pushed to a very right-wing, even kind of fascist direction. So I think it's going to be a task if these people do end up coming back one day. Well, what do you do about that in terms of how do you bridge the gap here? Or is it possible to kind of bring these people back into some kind of, minimally even social democratic politics that, is favorable to, transformation?
Yeah, just to complement, one thing that I think is a very useful argument, not just when discussing migration, but in general. Once migrants arrive in the US, they're already speaking to a different audience, and so it is also in their interest to blame, to sing to the tune that's already been put out to them by the corporate media and the establishment. But the one little step that I find very useful in many occasions is that even opposition pollsters find a widespread rejection of sanctions here. And that, coupled to the fact that it really is the economic conditions that are driving migration from Venezuela, it should really tear apart this notion that people are fleeing to chase the American dream or to chase freedom or however you want to call it.
Very true. So as our final question, we have someone joining us from Niger, Babukar Salmana. And so he's raised an important question, I think, for me as an activist in this Venezuela Solidarity Network, an activist based in North America. I think Venezuela's role as an independent country, its alliances with other independent and sanctioned countries, its alliance or its work in solidarity with the people of Palestine at this moment is all more reasons that they're under US attack. And Niemi is one, or Boubacar from Niger is wondering if we could address the relation between Venezuela and what's happening in the Sahel states, or if you have any comments more related to what I was saying as far as Venezuela's role internationally and how that places them also in the targets of US imperialism.
I'll say something quickly about that. I think while I can't, maybe Ricardo can comment more about the specific kinds of bilateral relationships that have been crafted particularly with Mali, with Niger, and the rest of the Burkina Faso. I guess counter-systemic Sahel Alliance Confederation. But I can speak to kind of that there is a lot of enthusiasm both within Venezuela and the Venezuelan left, but also even within government sectors regarding these, what we can regard as national, popular, civic, military governments that have come to power and have advanced policies that it's in very unexpected way have advanced policies that have countered U.S. and French neocolonialism in this crucial region. And then in my own research, my dissertation research is particularly on the Bolivarian Revolution in the 1990s and about the construction of political effective ties of the relationship between Chavez and the Venezuelan masses during this period. And after the February 4th, 1992 military coup that catapulted Chavez onto the national stage and made him this kind of household figure, that you see a similar kind of dynamic in the way that Chavez in many ways was the Venezuelan Tomas Sankara. I mean, of course, in a different context, and we're seeing I think that very much the left has, which is often very suspicious unfortunately, of military movements, especially in Latin America, but I think internationally, because it associates them with, military juntas, with military dictatorships, and doesn't and fails to kind of theorize, the more patriotic or national, popular, revolutionary elements within the militaries of places like Venezuela, or in this case, Burkina Faso, and the rest of the Sahel. So I think that there are a lot of similarities there, but I think that there's also shared challenges of how you go beyond kind of these existing forms to really construct durable kinds of revolutionary blocks that, of course, are going to involve labor unions, and are going to involve a whole host of different anti-systemic actors, and fundamentally the transformation of the neocolonial state.
Thank you, Lucas. Any words, Ricardo, to that question?
No, I think Lucas pretty much covered it. I think there are definitely very interesting parallels. I really need to know more about what's going on in the Sahel. But when we talk about Chavez, and going back to the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, and this proclamation of the end of history, which actually now Fukuyama has withdrawn, proclaimed the end of history. But anyway, it did seem like in the 1990s there was going to be a desert, and I don't think it's an overestimation to say that the Bolivarian Revolution really changed that, and really showed that another world was possible, and that the global South did not have to surrender and conform itself with this neoliberalism, or these advanced versions of neoliberalism that were being shoved upon them, either by the IMF and the World Bank, or by the neo-colonial powers. So Chavez does have that inspiration and that spark, which actually then propagates throughout South America and Latin America. And I cannot establish a direct link with Africa, even though Chavez is a very cherished figure in Africa, and also in parts of the Middle East and North Africa. It does have a lot of parallels in terms of having these national popular governments, which tend to come from the military for different reasons. But the fact that the military has a more organized structure and so on, and who put sovereignty above everything else, and that was also something that was non-negotiable for Chavez.
Excellent, thank you. So I think that will wrap up our question and answer time. While Ricardo and Lucas, you come up with any closing remarks, I'll make a few short announcements, but I'll give you a second to peruse the chat and see if there's anything that you missed that you may want to address, and also to collect your thoughts. I first want to encourage people to follow Venezuela Analysis, a co-sponsor of today's webinar. If you do not already, I think that they are also, of course, asking for funding and support, and all sorts of ways to support Venezuela Analysis. I will put that in the chat for their website and just a description. Perhaps most people are familiar, but maybe not everybody. So please go to their website and learn how to support Venezuela Analysis. I also wanted to share the social media information for the Venezuela Solidarity Network, which, as I explained, is a new-ish network of groups across North America. We launched less than 1 year ago, December 6th, I believe, 2023 was the launching of the Venezuela Solidarity Network. And there is our social media there in the chat. There will be the video will be posted onto YouTube from tonight. It's already on Facebook Live, so can be shared from there. But the Spanish language version of the webinar will also be available on the YouTube. The Venezuela Solidarity Network also meets regularly. We encourage people to get involved, and there is more information on our website and a form to join the VSN now in the chat. They're sponsoring organizations including the Alberto Lovera Bolivarian Circle in New York City, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the Alliance for Global Justice, Chicago, Cube Alba Solidarity, Code Pink, Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice in Canada, Friends of the Congo, the International Action Center, Just Peace Advocates, the Louis Riel Bolivarian Circle of Toronto, the Orinoco Tribune, Popular Resistance, the Sanctions Kill Campaign, Task Force on the Americas, Venezuela Analysis, and Workers' World Party, among other individuals. And I encourage you to fill out that form if you would like to join us at our monthly meetings where we plan webinars such as this, talk about current events in Venezuela and US attacks, and then also plan for further coordinated actions in defense of Venezuela's sovereignty and self-determination. Coming up in December is the International Human Rights Day. And to mark this occasion, the Venezuela Solidarity Network is joining with, as an endorser to the actions being organized by the Sanctions Kill Campaign and Americas Without Sanctions. It is a full week of in-person actions as well as a week of social media actions to call attention to the impact of sanctions on human rights of people living in Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and Palestine, which also, on top of the genocide, people in Palestine face Israeli genocidal Israeli siege. So these events are going to be taking place December 1st through 15th. And I'm going to share my screen quickly just to let folks see the poster for that. You can go to the website, which I will put in the chat, to see the full listing of events, to announce a local action, and especially mark your calendars for December 10th, the Human Rights Day Forum, which will be live broadcast as well as held in person in Washington, D.C., featuring Carlos Ron, Venezuela's North America representative at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Venezuela, as well as ambassadors from Cuba and Nicaragua and speakers direct from Palestine. I also want to encourage people to sign a petition that has been brought by the, as part of the Human Rights Week of Action, a petition directed at the US government demanding an end to sanctions against Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and this petition will be delivered in person during the week of actions. So I will put those links in the chat and encourage people to share them. There'll be more emails and information coming out soon. And I will turn over the microphone back to Lucas and to Ricardo. Ricardo, would you like to go first for any wrap-up comments?
Yeah, I'll go first and let Lucas have the final word. So basically, not much to add. Just again, thank the Venezuela Solidarity Network for this invitation. Also praise their work in recent times. I think it's a much welcome initiative to try and bring together all the solidarity movements and see how they can extend farther and boost the work. Also, special praise for Alison for her great work in organizing, coordinating, and moderating these webinars. She mentioned it, and I apologize for the product placement. Venezuela Analysis, we're currently running our yearly fundraiser. As you might know, we are entirely funded by readers and supporters, and so that means living in a constantly precarious financial state. But at the same time, it's what provides us with the independent editorial line that we certainly value above everything else. So if you have a chance, not just follow Venezuela Analysis, if you value our content, consider making a donation or becoming a monthly subscriber. Beyond that, as a general call, we always encourage people in the global north to organize delegations and come witness reality on the ground here in Venezuela. That's going to give you arguments to expand the solidarity work and counter imperialist talking points way more than what we can offer through these webinars. You'll be able to talk directly to grassroots activists who will not shy away from the contradictions. They will actually explain and give you a very useful perspective on how, despite all the attacks, despite all the setbacks and so on, there is still a critical mass that's fighting for the construction of socialism under these conditions, and that really means a lot, and it will give you a lot of proverbial ammunition to spread the solidarity work and counter the imperialist talking points. So basically, yeah, that was it. Again, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the great questions, and we'll continue working and fighting together.
Yeah, I've already talked a lot, so I'll just echo everything Ricardo said. Thank you so much to the the Venezuela Solidarity Network for this lovely invitation. It was a great pleasure to share with you guys tonight. Also, I would also double down and encourage everyone to join an organization, any of the organizations listed or any other that are committed to anti-systemic politics and revolutionary politics in general, and that read support Venezuela Analysis and all the other great allied grassroots media initiatives that we form part of the same we're part of the same family. And and lastly, the invitation to come to Venezuela, that we'd love to have you here and to bring you to the barrios and show you the very interesting kinds of popular power initiatives that continue to grow amidst the relentless imperialist siege. So Chavez vive, la lucha sigue.
La lucha sigue. The struggle continues. Thank you. While I thank our interpreters, I'm going to start sending people invitations to rejoin tonight's action as a panelist. That means you'll then have the ability to turn on your camera if you'd like and are encouraged. We do a group photo together, probably do a few chants, and it's a good way to show our unity across borders, around the world, and solidarity with Venezuela. Kind of a tradition here at the monthly picket actions and online discussions. I wanted to also say a big thank you to our interpreters for today. We'll turn off the interpretation system in a minute so everyone can kind of participate in this group photo. But I thank you very much to Julieta and Mercedes, who translated the webinar from English into Spanish and is going to make that possible for us to share online. We want to make sure we have these discussions accessible, the information that we learn accessible to anyone that may want to advocate for Venezuela's independence and sovereignty against US-sponsored attacks or those coming from US allies, such as the government of Canada, where I am located. So if you'd like to be able to turn on your camera and join the photo, go ahead and raise your hand. I think everyone has probably received an invitation at this point, but if there's somebody that I've missed, that is an easy way to do it. Thank you again to Venezuela Analysis for co-sponsoring this with us. Our next webinar will be the December 10th action, which is being planned in person in Washington, D.C. as part of this Human Rights Week of Action with Americans Without Sanctions and Sanctions Kill. And those links are in the chat. That webinar will be broadcast live and people will be able to participate in it online. So I encourage people to join in. If anyone else like to join the photo? Okay, we've got a few more hands. Thank you, everybody, for your patience tonight. It is great to see you all. You'll get an invitation that says, would you like to rejoin as a panelist? And you have to agree. You have to say yes. Mike, if you want to go ahead and turn off the interpretation, then we will all be in the same room. Oh, more people are saying yes. We've got some delays, delays here. And everyone should be able to turn on your cameras, but if you're having trouble, I'll just double check the settings here. Yes, you will be able to start your video, but you do have to be the one to do it, not me. I'm gonna also like it so everyone can unmute themselves if they would like. Okay. I think we've got everybody almost now. Good to see you all. You can flick through the photos and see everybody. We'll say together, hands off Venezuela.
Hands off Venezuela.
Hands off Venezuela.
Hands off Venezuela.
All right, everyone.
Viva Chavez.
We'll see you in Venezuela. Viva Chavez. We'll see you on the streets. Let's continue this work together.
Power to the people. That's a Yankee imperialism.
There we go. Thank you. I think that was you. See you soon. Viva Venezuela.
See you in Caracas.
Viva.